When a decision comes down unanimously, 9 justices speaking with one voice, it immediately demands our attention not because unanimity is comforting, but because in today's deeply divided legal and political climate, it is profoundly unsettling. A 9-0 ruling is not business as usual. It is rare, almost historic, and when it happens, it often signals that something fundamental has gone wrong beneath the surface of our constitutional system. This is not about agreement across ideological lines for the sake of harmony. It is about the court recognizing a clear constitutional problem so serious that disagreement itself becomes impossible. And that is exactly why this moment should make all of us pause and ask difficult questions. In recent decades, the Supreme Court has reflected the fractures of the nation itself. Closed decisions, narrow majorities, sharply worded dissents, these have become the norm. So when every justice, regardless of philosophy or background, reaches the same conclusion, it tells us the issue before them cut to the core of constitutional structure. This kind of ruling usually means the justices believe the Constitution's boundaries were not just tested but crossed. It suggests that the case was not about policy preferences but about protecting the basic framework that keeps power from concentrating too heavily in one place. At the heart of this ruling is a warning, quiet, legal, but unmistakable. It signals concern over how power is being exercised, interpreted, or expanded, often without sufficient constitutional grounding. Whether the issue involved executive authority, legislative overreach, or procedural shortcuts, the unanimity suggests the court saw a dangerous precedent forming. A precedent that, if left unchallenged, could gradually weaken the separation of powers that defines constitutional governance. And history teaches us that constitutional erosion rarely happens all at once. It happens through small exceptions that slowly become normal. What makes this especially significant is that the court did not rely on ideological arguments to reach its conclusion. Instead, it leaned on constitutional text, long-standing principles, and structural limits that transcend politics. That kind of reasoning is deliberate. It sends a message not just to the parties involved in the case, but to every branch of government. There are lines that cannot be crossed, even in moments of urgency, crisis, or political pressure. The Constitution is not a flexible suggestion. It is a binding framework. This raises an uncomfortable question for the nation. If the court felt compelled to act unanimously, how close were we to normalizing a constitutional violation? How often have similar actions occurred without being challenged? And how many were justified in the name of efficiency, security, or progress? The ruling forces us to confront the reality that constitutional guardrails are under constant stress, especially in times when institutions are pushed to respond faster than the law was ever designed to move. There's also a deeper implication here. A unanimous ruling strips away the illusion that constitutional disputes are always partisan. It reminds us that the Constitution itself has an independent authority separate from political agendas. When all 9 justices agree, it becomes harder to dismiss the decision as ideological or biased. Instead, it frames the issue as a constitutional correction and effort to restore balance rather than impose preference. That alone challenges the growing perception that constitutional interpretation is merely another political battleground. But unanimity does not mean simplicity. In fact, it often means the opposite. It suggests the justices saw the potential for widespread damage if the issue were left unresolved. Damage not just to one law or one case, but to the integrity of constitutional governance itself. This is why such rulings often reference institutional boundaries, procedural fairness, and the long-term health of the system. They are not just resolving a dispute, they're reinforcing the architecture of democracy. And here is where the real concern lies. If it required a rare 9-0 decision to correct this issue, what does that say about the trajectory of constitutional interpretation leading up to it? It suggests that pressures, political, economic, or administrative, are increasingly pushing institutions to the edge of constitutional limits. It suggests that convenience is beginning to compete with constitutional restraint. And when that happens, the role of the court shifts from interpreter to guardian. This ruling, then, is less a victory lap and more a warning sign. It tells us the Constitution still holds, but also that it is being tested in ways that demand vigilance. The justices did not celebrate consensus, they delivered correction, and in doing so, they reminded us that unanimity is not reassurance. It is an alarm bell rung softly, but clearly, for anyone willing to listen. The real weight of this decision does not end with the courtroom, or the moment the ruling was read aloud. It begins there. What follows a unanimous constitutional ruling like this is often far more powerful than the ruling itself, because it reshapes how power is exercised, challenged, and restrained going forward. This decision sets a constitutional marker, a line drawn not just for today, but for every future moment when authority is tested and limits are tempted. And once such a line is drawn, it changes behavior across the entire system. Precedent is the quiet engine of constitutional law. Laws can be rewritten, policies can shift, but precedent lingers, guiding decisions long after the headlines fade. This ruling now stands as a reference point for courts across the country, signaling how similar disputes can't be evaluated. It narrows the room for interpretation where ambiguity once existed and strengthens the legal footing for those who challenge overreach. That means future cases will not start from zero. They will begin under the shadow of this decision, with its clear message about constitutional boundaries. For lawmakers and officials, the implications are immediate and unavoidable. Actions that once operated in legal gray areas now face sharper scrutiny. Strategies that relied on silence or uncertainty within constitutional interpretation are suddenly exposed. This ruling forces a recalibration, compelling decision-makers to weigh not just political outcomes but constitutional risk. It raises the cost of overreach, not politically, but legally, where consequences endure beyond election cycles and public opinion shifts. The ruling also reshapes the relationship between citizens and the state. Constitutional decisions are often framed as abstract legal debates, but their impact is deeply personal. When the court reinforces limits on power, it indirectly expands the space for individual rights and procedural protections. It strengthens the ability of citizens, businesses, and institutions to challenge actions that stretch authority too far. In doing so, it reaffirms that constitutional rights are not conditional, not suspended by convenience or crisis, but persistent and enforceable. Yet there is a tension embedded in this outcome. While the ruling strengthens constitutional protections, it also exposes how fragile those protections can become when boundaries are not actively defended. The fact that such a strong correction was needed suggests that constitutional norms are under pressure from modern governance itself. Speed, complexity, and centralized authority have become defining features of contemporary systems, often clashing with a framework designed to slow power down, divide it, and restrain it. This ruling highlights that conflict and forces the system to confront it looking ahead. This decision will influence not only courtrooms but the strategies of those in power. Future policies will likely be drafted more cautiously with constitutional justification built in from the start rather than retrofitted later. Legal advisors will point to this ruling as a warning, a reminder that even broadly supported actions can collapse if they bypass constitutional limits. Over time, this may lead to fewer aggressive expansions of authority and more deliberate, transparent governance if the lesson is taken seriously. Public trust is another critical consequence. In an era when institutions are often viewed with skepticism, a unanimous constitutional ruling carries symbolic weight. It demonstrates that there are moments when the system can rise above division and act in defense of principle rather than preference. For some, this may restore confidence that constitutional checks still function. For others, it raises deeper questions about how close, say, the system came to failing before correction was applied. Either way, the ruling becomes part of the public consciousness, shaping how legitimacy and authority are perceived. There's also a long-term cultural effect. Constitutional law does not operate in isolation. It shapes civic understanding of rights and responsibilities. This ruling reinforces the idea that the Constitution is not merely a historical document, but an active constraint on power. It teaches, implicitly, that unanimity is reserved for moments when the structure itself is at stake. That lesson will echo in classrooms, legal arguments, and public debate for years to come. But perhaps the most important consequence lies in what this ruling demands of the future. It places responsibility back where it belongs, not solely on courts, but in every branch of government and every citizen. Constitutional boundaries cannot be protected only after they are crossed. They require constant respect, restraint, and awareness. This decision makes clear that the system can still correct itself, but it also warns that self-correction is not guaranteed. In the end, this ruling is not just about what was stopped, but about what must now be preserved. It reminds us that constitutional strength is measured not by how much power can be exercised, but by how firmly limits are honored.